England, 1803. The carriage wheels rattled over the uneven country road as Florence Miller clutched her modest valise to her chest. The rolling hills of Hampshire stretched before her, emerald and gold under the autumn sun. She adjusted her simple bonnet and tried to calm her racing heart. "Hartley House just beyond that ridge, miss," the driver called over his shoulder. "Finest estate in the county, they say." Florence nodded, grateful for the distraction from her thoughts. At 23, she had never ventured this far from her father's rural vicarage in Dorset. But with his recent passing and the new vicar's arrival with his own large family, she had found herself without a home and with precious little means. The carriage crested the hill and Florence's breath caught in her throat. Hartley House rose from the landscape like a vision from a dream, a grand limestone mansion with tall windows that gleamed in the sunlight, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens and a sweeping lawn that seemed to stretch forever. "My word," she whispered. The driver chuckled. "Wait till you see it up close, miss." As they approached, Florence observed a man standing rigidly at the entrance, tall and imposing in a perfectly tailored dark coat, his posture betraying a military bearing. His features were striking: a strong jaw, prominent cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through her as the carriage came to a stop. "That'll be His Grace himself," the driver murmured. "The Duke doesn't usually greet new staff. Consider yourself noticed." Florence felt her cheeks warm as she gathered her belongings. The driver helped her down, and she smoothed her simple grey travelling dress, suddenly acutely aware of its modest quality. "Miss Miller, I presume?" The Duke's voice was deep and resonant, but utterly devoid of warmth. "Yes, Your Grace." She cursed, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. "Albert Harrington, Duke of Hanover." He studied her for a moment. "You come highly recommended by Lady Wexford, though I confess I expected someone older." Florence met his gaze steadily. "I assure you, Your Grace, what I lack in years, I make up for in dedication. My father ensured I received an education uncommon for a clergyman's daughter." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, before his expression returned to its customary severity. "Indeed. Well, Mrs. Chambers, the housekeeper, will show you to your quarters and acquaint you with the children's schedule." He turned to leave, then paused. "Dinner is at 7. The children dine at 6. I expect punctuality and diligence, Miss Miller." "Of course, Your Grace." As he strode away, Florence released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A plump, kindly-looking woman in a dark dress and crisp white apron approached, offering a sympathetic smile. "Don't mind His Grace's manner, dear. He's been that way since the late Duchess passed, God rest her soul." The housekeeper caught herself. "Oh, forgive me, I mean heavens above, listen to me prattling on. I'm Mrs. Chambers, come along now, you must be exhausted." As Florence followed Mrs. Chambers into the grand entrance hall, she was struck by both the opulence and the stillness of the house. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and ancestral portraits lined the walls, stern faces gazing down upon her. "The children are in the schoolroom now with Mr. Bennet, their tutor for mathematics and Latin," Mrs. Chambers explained as they climbed the grand staircase. "You'll take over their English studies, history, and deportment. His Grace is particular about their education." "How many children are there?" Florence asked, trying to recall the details from Lady Wexford's letter. "3. Master Edward is 10, the heir, of course. Then there's Miss Charlotte, who's 8, and little Miss Sophia, just 6. Good children, if a bit, well, withdrawn. They've been through much, poor lambs." They reached the east wing, where Mrs. Chambers showed Florence to a modest but comfortable bedchamber with a small sitting area and a window overlooking the rose garden. "The nursery and schoolroom are just down the hall. You'll have these rooms to yourself, a privilege not afforded to most of the staff, but His Grace insisted the governess have privacy for lesson preparation." Florence placed her valise on the bed. "When might I meet the children?" "After they finish with Mr. Bennet at 4. Then they have an hour of free time before dinner." Mrs. Chambers hesitated. "Miss Miller, I should warn you, we've had 3 governesses in the past year. The children are testing." Florence raised an eyebrow. "Testing? Master Edward has a penchant for clever pranks. Miss Charlotte asks questions that would confound a university professor, and little Miss Sophia has perfected the art of disappearing precisely when it's time for her lessons." Mrs. Chambers sighed. "Their mother's death affected them deeply, and His Grace, well, He's not been as present as he perhaps should be. Florence nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your candor, Mrs. Chambers. I appreciate knowing what to expect. After Mrs. Chambers departed, Florence unpacked her meager belongings, including her most treasured possessions, her father's pocket watch and a small collection of beloved books. As she placed them carefully on the modest shelf, she wondered what manner of challenge awaited her in the three young Harringtons. At precisely 4 o'clock, Florence made her way to the schoolroom. She paused outside the door, hearing a male voice reciting Latin conjugations, followed by a chorus of young voices repeating them with varying degrees of enthusiasm. A moment later, the door opened, and a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose emerged. He startled slightly at the sight of her. "Ah, you must be Miss Miller, Roland Bennett." He offered a quick bow. "Good luck, you'll need it." He hurried past her before she could respond. Taking a deep breath, Florence stepped into the schoolroom. 3 pairs of eyes immediately fixed upon her, one curious, one suspicious, and one openly hostile. "Good afternoon," she said brightly. "I'm Miss Miller, your new governess." The oldest boy, Edward, she presumed, leaned back in his chair with an air of studied indifference. "How long do you intend to stay, Miss Miller?" Governess Hawkins lasted 3 weeks. Miss Pendleton managed almost 2 months before she fled in tears. Charlotte, a serious-looking girl with her father's piercing eyes, studied Florence intently. "Do you know any interesting stories?" Miss Pendleton only knew dull ones about virtuous maidens and moral lessons. The youngest, Sophia, said nothing, but her small fingers worked methodically to fold a piece of paper into what appeared to be a bird. Florence smiled, undaunted. "To answer your questions, I intend to stay as long as I'm needed, Master Edward. And yes, Miss Charlotte, I know many stories. Some about virtuous maidens, certainly, but also about brave explorers, cunning foxes, and ordinary people who discover they are capable of extraordinary things." She turned to Sophia. "And what a beautiful bird you're making, Miss Sophia. Perhaps later you could teach me how." Sophia's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly looked down, though not before Florence caught the ghost of a smile. Edward exchanged a glance with his sisters. "Father says we're behind in our studies. He says it's because we've had too many incompetent governesses." "Then we shall have to prove him wrong, shan't we?" Florence replied evenly. She moved to the bookshelves, running her finger along the spines. "Since we've only just met, perhaps we might spend this hour becoming acquainted. Would you show me your favorite volumes?" Charlotte hesitated, then pointed to a leather-bound collection on the highest shelf. "Those are our mother's books. Father had them brought from the main library after she died. We're not allowed to touch them without permission." Florence noted the longing in the girl's voice. "Then we shall ask permission at the earliest opportunity. For now, what about these?" She gestured to the other shelves. For the next hour, Florence let the children guide her through their collection, noting their interests and temperaments. Edward, despite his initial hostility, revealed a passion for tales of naval battles and exploration. Charlotte gravitated toward poetry and natural philosophy. Little Sophia remained mostly silent, but perked up visibly when Florence mentioned fairy tales from distant lands. As the clock chimed 5, Florence closed the volume they had been examining. "Tomorrow, we shall begin our lessons in earnest. But perhaps if you wish, I might read to you for a few minutes before you prepare for dinner." The children exchanged glances again, seeming to communicate silently. "You may read from the Tales of King Arthur," Edward said finally, with the air of one granting a great favor. "Page 73, that's where Miss Pendleton stopped before she left." Florence retrieved the book, settled into the reading chair by the window, and began. As she read of Arthur's quest, she infused the words with all the drama and emotion she could muster, creating different voices for each character. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice the door opening slightly or the tall figure that paused there, listening. When she finished the chapter, she looked up to find all 3 children leaning forward in their seats, eyes wide with anticipation. "Is that all for today?" Sophia asked, speaking for the first time, her voice small but clear. "For today, yes," Florence smiled, "but we shall continue tomorrow." As the children filed out to prepare for dinner, Florence closed the book and placed it carefully on the desk. It was only then that she noticed the Duke standing in the doorway, an unreadable expression on his face. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly, "I didn't see you there." "Evidently," he replied. His eyes moved from her to the book in her hands and back again. "You have a gift for reading aloud, Miss Miller." Florence felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Your Grace. Stories were a staple in my father's household. He believed they could teach as much as any sermon." "Indeed." The Duke seemed about to say more, then checked himself. The children appeared unengaged. That is uncommon these days. "They're bright children. I believe they simply need the right material to capture their interest." The Duke studied her for a moment longer. "We shall see if your methods bear fruit, Miss Miller. Good evening." As he turned to leave, Florence caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a sadness so profound it made her heart ache. She wondered what sort of man lay beneath that rigid exterior, and what had happened to make him build such formidable walls around himself. That night, as Florence prepared for bed in her new quarters, she gazed out the window at the moonlit gardens below. Hartley House was beautiful but haunted, not by spirits but by grief and loss. The Duke, his children, even the house itself seemed suspended in mourning, unable to move forward. She thought of the children's faces as she read to them, how for a brief moment they had been simply children again, lost in a story rather than three small souls burdened by sadness. Perhaps, she thought, that was where she should begin, not with Latin verbs or geography lessons, but with stories that might kindle a spark in their eyes and, in time, help heal their wounded hearts. Florence had no illusions about her position. She was a governess, a servant, regardless of the private rooms and the Duke's unexpected compliment. Yet as she extinguished her candle and slipped between the cool sheets, she could not help but feel that something significant had begun that day at Hartley House, something that extended beyond grammar lessons and multiplication tables. She fell asleep with the image of the Duke's haunted eyes in her mind and the strange, unbidden thought that perhaps he needed stories as much as his children did. The weeks passed, and autumn deepened across the Hampshire countryside. The manicured grounds of Hartley House transformed into a canvas of amber, crimson and gold. Inside, Florence found herself settling into a rhythm with her young charges, who, while still occasionally testing her patience, had begun to respond to her methods. Each morning began with traditional lessons, grammar, composition and history for Edward, similar subjects but modified for Charlotte, and basic reading and writing for little Sophia. The afternoons were devoted to what Florence called living education. Nature walks through the estate's walled gardens, sketching expeditions to the ancient oak grove at the property's edge, or dramatic readings in the orangery, where exotic plants from distant colonies thrived under glass. It was during one such afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival, that Florence encountered the Duke unexpectedly. She and the children had retreated to the orangery as a light rain pattered against the glass roof. The children sat on cushions arranged on the stone floor, while Florence, perched on a wrought-iron garden chair, read from a volume of poetry. "She walks in beauty like the night," Florence read, her voice soft in the humid air of the conservatory. "Of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright, meet in her aspect and her eyes," a deep voice completed from the doorway. Florence looked up with a start to find the Duke standing there, watching them. The children scrambled to their feet, and Florence rose quickly, cursing, "Your Grace, I didn't hear you approach." "Evidently poetry has a captivating effect, Miss Miller." There was no censure in his tone, merely observation. "Lord Byron, if I'm not mistaken." "Yes, Your Grace." Florence was surprised by his recognition of the verse. The Duke moved further into the orangery, examining a flowering plant with apparent interest. "And how do you find your pupils progressing, Miss Miller? It has been nearly a month." "Very well, Your Grace. Master Edward has shown marked improvement in his composition. Miss Charlotte has a natural aptitude for natural philosophy that we've been cultivating, and Miss Sophia—" She glanced at the youngest child with a smile. "Miss Sophia has read an entire primer by herself this week." The Duke looked at his youngest daughter with an expression that, for him, constituted astonishment. "Is this true, Sophia?" The little girl nodded, her eyes wide. "Miss Miller says I read as well as girls twice my age, Father." "Indeed?" The Duke's gaze returned to Florence. "That is most impressive, Miss Miller. My compliments. The credit belongs to your daughter, Your Grace. She has worked very diligently." A silence fell, broken only by the soft patter of rain on glass. Then the Duke cleared his throat. I've been corresponding with Lady Worthington about the children's progress. She has invited them, and their governess, to her annual autumn gathering at Willow Creek Manor. A small affair, mostly educational in nature. There will be a noted naturalist presenting his collection, and several musical performances. He paused. I thought it might complement your living education approach. Florence's surprise must have shown on her face, for the Duke added, Unless you find the prospect disagreeable, Miss Miller. Not at all, Your Grace. I think it would be wonderful for the children. She hesitated, then ventured, Will you be attending as well? Something flickered in his eyes. Discomfort, perhaps. I had not planned to. Estate matters require my attention. Of course, Florence nodded, ignoring the inexplicable twinge of disappointment she felt. However, he continued almost reluctantly, perhaps I could make arrangements to join you for the naturalist's presentation. Edward has shown interest in such matters. The boy looked up at his father with poorly concealed delight. Have you, father? I've been reading about exotic beetles in the book Miss Miller found in the library. The Duke regarded his son with surprise, as though seeing him anew. Have you indeed? Then I shall certainly make the effort to attend. He turned to Florence. The gathering is 3 days hence. Mrs. Chambers will see that you and the children are properly outfitted. With that, he nodded curtly and departed, leaving Florence to wonder at the small step forward they had just witnessed, both in the Duke's relationship with his children and perhaps in his opinion of her. The day of Lady Worthington's gathering dawned clear and crisp. The children were beside themselves with excitement. It was their first social outing since their mother's death 2 years prior. Even Mrs. Chambers seemed cheerful as she helped the children into their finest clothes. His Grace has instructed the carriage be brought round at 10, she informed Florence, as she adjusted the collar on Edward's jacket. And he's arranged for new gloves and bonnets for the young ladies. Florence herself had been provided with a new dress for the occasion, a modest but elegant gown of deep burgundy wool, with a matching Spencer jacket and bonnet. It was the finest garment she had ever worn, and she felt both grateful and uncomfortable as she smoothed the fabric. There you are, miss, Mrs. Chambers said approvingly as she stepped back to examine Florence. Quite proper for a governess accompanying the Duke's children, respectable without drawing undue attention. Florence wasn't entirely sure whether to be flattered or not by this assessment, but she thanked the housekeeper nonetheless. The journey to Willow Creek Manor took just over an hour, during which the children peppered Florence with questions about what to expect. Edward was particularly concerned about making a good impression on the naturalist, while Charlotte wondered if there might be other children her age to converse with. Sophia merely clutched her new kid leather gloves with undisguised glee. Willow Creek Manor proved to be a handsome Tudor mansion with modern additions, set amidst sweeping lawns that sloped down to a gently flowing stream lined with its namesake willows. A surprising number of carriages were already parked in the circular drive when they arrived. I thought Lady Worthington said this was to be a small gathering, Florence murmured, as she helped Sophia down from the carriage. Lady Worthington's definition of small is relative, came a familiar voice behind her. Florence turned to find the Duke dismounting from his horse, looking immaculate in his riding clothes. Her heart performed an unexpected leap at the sight of him. Your Grace, we didn't expect you until later. I found my estate matters less pressing than anticipated. His eyes moved over the assembled group, lingering briefly on Florence in her new attire before shifting to his children. You all look very presentable. Remember, you represent the House of Harrington today. The children straightened their postures immediately, though Florence caught the glimmer of a smile on Charlotte's face as she took her father's proffered arm. Shall we proceed, Miss Miller? The Duke extended his other arm to Florence, who hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of a governess taking the arm of her employer. I should remain with Sophia and Edward, Your Grace, she demurred. A flicker of something, disappointment, crossed his face before he nodded. Of course, how thoughtless of me. They were greeted at the entrance by Lady Worthington herself, a sprightly woman of advancing years, with keen eyes and an air of benevolent authority. Albert, my dear boy, she exclaimed, taking the Duke's hands in hers, how wonderful to see you in society again, and these must be your children. How they've grown. She bent slightly to address the children directly. Your mother was my goddaughter, did you know? She would be so proud of you all. Charlotte's eyes widened at this direct reference to her mother, while Edward merely nodded solemnly. Sophia, suddenly shy, pressed against Florence's skirts. Lady Worthington straightened and turned her attention to Florence. "And you must be Miss Miller. I've heard much about your innovative approaches to education." Her eyes twinkled. "Albert writes that you've accomplished more in a month than his previous governesses managed in a year combined." Florence felt her cheeks warm at this unexpected praise and glanced at the Duke, who was suddenly very interested in removing his riding gloves. "Your ladyship is too kind. The children are naturally bright and eager to learn. Modesty as well as competence. How refreshing." Lady Worthington laughed. "Come along, all of you. The naturalist, Mr. Finchley, has set up his displays in the West Salon, and there are several young people near Charlotte's age in the music room." The gathering was indeed larger than Florence had anticipated, with perhaps 30 guests in total. Most were from the local gentry, though there were a few titled visitors from London who had extended their country stays into the autumn. Florence guided the children through the various activities with quiet authority, ensuring they were both entertained and educated. Edward was enraptured by Mr. Finchley's collection of beetles from the West Indies, while Charlotte discovered a kindred spirit in Lady Worthington's granddaughter, a serious girl of 9 who shared her interest in botany. Sophia, after initial shyness, was coaxed into joining a small group of children learning country dances in the music room. Throughout the afternoon, Florence was aware of the Duke's presence on the periphery of her activities. He conversed with other gentlemen, paid his respects to various ladies, and even engaged Mr. Finchley in a lengthy discussion about tropical specimens. Yet whenever she looked up, she found his gaze drifting toward her and the children, a thoughtful expression on his face. During a musical interlude, Florence found herself momentarily alone, the children having been drawn into a group game in the adjacent room. She stood by a window overlooking the gardens, listening to a young lady playing the pianoforte with admirable skill. "You seem to have worked magic with my children, Miss Miller." She turned to find the Duke beside her, his voice low to avoid disturbing the music. "Not magic, Your Grace, merely patience and genuine interest in their minds and hearts." He was silent for a moment, watching the performance. "Things their father has been deficient in providing, you mean to say?" "I said no such thing, Your Grace." "But you thought it." His tone held no accusation, merely resignation. "And you would be correct." Florence turned to face him fully, keeping her voice gentle. "Grief affects us all differently, Your Grace. The children understand that." "Do they?" His gaze moved to the doorway where Edward could be seen laughing with another boy his age, a sound so rare at Hartley House that it seemed almost foreign. "I've been so consumed with my own pain that I've failed to help them navigate theirs." The raw honesty in his voice moved her deeply. "It's never too late to begin, Your Grace." His eyes returned to hers, and in them she saw vulnerability beneath the customary reserve. "Is that what you've shown them with your stories and poetry, Miss Miller? How to begin again?" "Perhaps." She smiled softly. "Stories have a way of helping us make sense of our own narratives, of showing us possibilities we might not otherwise imagine." For a long moment he held her gaze, and Florence felt something shift between them, a recognition, an understanding that transcended their respective positions. The music ended, breaking the spell. The Duke straightened, his expression returning to its usual composed state. "We should join the others for the luncheon," he said. "Lady Worthington will have us seated soon." As they moved together toward the dining room, Florence was acutely conscious of his presence beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. It was improper, perhaps, for a governess to walk alongside her employer rather than several paces behind, but the Duke seemed unconcerned with this breach of protocol. At luncheon, Florence expected to be seated at the far end of the table with the children and other staff. To her surprise, Lady Worthington had placed her near the middle of the table, between Mr. Finchley and a local clergyman, while the children were seated with their young companions further down. The Duke, naturally, was at Lady Worthington's right hand at the head of the table. As the meal progressed, Florence found herself drawn into a lively discussion about education with Mr. Finchley and several other guests. Her views on incorporating practical experience and nature study into traditional learning were met with interest and approval. "You sound more like a progressive headmistress than a governess, Miss Miller," commented a gentleman across the table with a smile. Miss Miller has a unique perspective that has proven invaluable to my children's development, the Duke interjected from further up the table, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. She has accomplished more in weeks than others have in months. Florence felt her cheeks warm at this public praise, particularly when she noticed several ladies exchanging significant glances. One leaned to whisper behind her fan to another, eyes darting between Florence and the Duke. The remainder of the afternoon passed pleasantly, though Florence was now uncomfortably aware of curious eyes following her interactions with the Duke. When he joined her and the children to observe a demonstration of prismatic light effects by Mr. Finchley, she was careful to maintain a proper distance and address him with scrupulous formality. As they prepared to depart late in the afternoon, Lady Worthington drew Florence aside while the Duke was occupied with final farewells. "My dear Miss Miller," the elderly woman said, patting Florence's hand, "I am delighted to see the positive effect you've had on Albert's children. And on Albert himself, if I may be so bold." "I'm not sure I understand your meaning, my lady," Florence replied carefully. Lady Worthington's eyes twinkled. "Don't you? This is the first time in 2 years I've seen him engage with society willingly, the first time I've seen him truly look at his children. And the way he looks at you, my dear." She paused, then seemed to reconsider her words. "Well, suffice it to say, you've brought a spark back to Hartley House that has been sorely missed." Before Florence could formulate a response, the Duke approached and Lady Worthington smoothly shifted to expressing her delight at their attendance. The journey home was filled with the children's excited chatter about their experiences. Even Edward, usually so reserved, was animated as he described the exotic specimens he had seen. The Duke rode alongside the carriage, occasionally leaning toward the window to comment on their observations or answer their questions. As Hartley House came into view, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Florence felt a curious mixture of emotions. The day had been a success. The children had flourished in the social setting, and the Duke had engaged with them more naturally than she had yet witnessed. Yet she was troubled by Lady Worthington's insinuations and the whispers she had noticed at luncheon. She was, after all, merely a governess, a position that, while respectable, placed her in an awkward middle ground between family and servant. Any attention from the Duke beyond professional regard could only lead to difficulty, both for her reputation and for her position within the household. As they descended from the carriage, the Duke dismounted and handed his reins to a waiting groom. "Children, go with Mrs. Chambers and prepare for dinner. I wish to speak with Miss Miller for a moment." Florence's heart quickened as the children obediently followed the housekeeper inside, leaving her alone with the Duke in the fading light. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Miller," he said, his voice low. "Today was significant for my family. For the first time since their mother's passing, I saw my children truly engaged with the world again. They merely needed the opportunity, Your Grace, and perhaps your presence alongside them meant more than you know." He studied her face in the golden evening light. "You have a gift for seeing beneath surfaces, Miss Miller. It is disconcerting at times. I apologize if I've overstepped." "No," he interrupted gently. "It is not an accusation, but an observation. Few people speak to me with such candor these days. It is refreshing." Florence was acutely aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that surrounded him. "There is something else," he continued. "Lady Worthington has invited us to her Christmas gathering at her London residence. It is a larger affair, a ball, in fact. She has specifically requested your presence." He paused. "I would not normally ask this of a governess, but the children have grown so attached to you, and Lady Worthington was most insistent." Florence's mind raced. A London ball was far beyond her experience, far beyond the proper scope of her position. Yet the thought of the children experiencing their first real Christmas celebration since their mother's death, with both their father and herself to support them. "Of course, Your Grace. If you feel it would benefit the children, I would be honored to accompany them." Something like relief flashed across his face. "Excellent. We shall depart for London in 3 weeks' time. The children's winter wardrobes will need to be updated, and of course you will require appropriate attire for the occasion. I've taken the liberty of arranging an appointment with a modiste in Winchester next week." He hesitated. "I hope you don't find that presumptuous." "It is most generous, Your Grace," she managed, though her mind was reeling at the implications. He nodded, seeming suddenly uncomfortable with his own generosity. "Well then, good evening, Miss Miller." "Good evening, Your Grace." As Florence watched him stride into the house, she couldn't help but wonder what currents were pulling them forward and where they might lead. The rational part of her mind warned of danger, of whispers and ruined reputations, of the vast gulf between a duke and a clergyman's daughter employed as a governess. Yet another part, a part she tried to silence but couldn't quite subdue, recalled the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the way his voice softened when they spoke of his children, the vulnerability he had shown her at Lady Worthington's gathering. That night, as she prepared for bed, Florence stood at her window and gazed out at the moonlit gardens. Autumn was fading. Soon winter would arrive, bringing with it a journey to London and a ball that might change everything. For better or worse, she could not say. But as she extinguished her candle and slipped beneath the covers, she found herself, for the first time in many years, daring to hope. London, December 1803. Snow fell in gentle flurries beyond the frost-laced windows of the Hanover family's London residence, a handsome townhouse in Grosvenor Square that had remained shuttered since the Duchess's death. Now, however, it hummed with activity as servants aired out rooms. Deliveries arrived from various merchants, and 3 excited children explored their rediscovered urban domain. Florence stood in the children's schoolroom on the 3rd floor, unpacking educational materials she had brought from Hampshire. The London house, though smaller than Hartley House, was no less impressive, with its elegant furnishings and valuable artworks. The schoolroom itself was bright and airy, with large windows overlooking the square below. "Miss Miller," Sophia burst into the room, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Chambers says we may go to Gunter's tea shop tomorrow for ices, even though it's winter. And Father says there might be a puppet show in the park if the weather improves." Florence smiled at the child's enthusiasm. "That sounds wonderful, Miss Sophia. But remember what we discussed about knocking before entering a room?" Sophia's expression turned contrite. "I forgot. I'm sorry, Miss Miller." "That's quite all right. Now why don't you help me arrange these books on the shelf? I believe your brother and sister are with Mrs. Chambers, selecting their attire for Lady Worthington's ball." The little girl's eyes widened. "Oh, I should be there too. Charlotte says I may wear ribbons in my hair." She turned and darted out, remembering at the last moment to close the door properly behind her. Florence chuckled, returning to her task. The children's transformation over the past weeks had been remarkable. Edward had begun to show natural leadership qualities rather than mere defiance. Charlotte's intellectual curiosity had blossomed, and little Sophia had emerged from her shell to reveal a spirited, affectionate nature. The Duke, too, had changed. Since the gathering at Willow Creek Manor, he had taken a more active interest in his children's education and well-being. He dined with them more frequently, joined them for occasional outings, and even requested that Florence provide weekly reports on their progress directly to him rather than through Mr. Porter, his secretary. These meetings had become something Florence both anticipated and dreaded, moments of connection that sometimes stretched beyond professional discourse into more personal territory. He had begun to ask her opinion on matters beyond education, had shared memories of his late wife's passion for music, had even, on occasion, revealed glimpses of his own childhood. Each such conversation left Florence increasingly confused about her place in the household. She was still a governess, yet the Duke treated her more as a trusted advisor, perhaps even a friend. The staff had noticed, of course. Mrs. Chambers had become almost maternal in her warnings about maintaining proper boundaries, while Mr. Porter regarded her with barely concealed suspicion. A knock at the schoolroom door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, expecting one of the children, but instead found the Duke himself standing in the doorway. "Your Grace," she cursed quickly, "I didn't expect you. The children are with Mrs. Chambers, selecting their attire for the ball." "I'm aware," he replied, stepping into the room. "I wish to speak with you privately." Florence's heart quickened. "Of course, Your Grace." The Duke moved to the window, gazing out at the snowy square below. "Lady Worthington's ball is 3 days hence. It will be the children's first major social event in London since—" He paused. "Well, you understand. They're very excited, Your Grace, and a bit nervous, particularly Edward. He's aware of his position as your heir, and feels the weight of representing the family name." The Duke turned to her, his expression softening. "He's spoken to you of this?" Yes, during our history lesson yesterday, we were discussing the responsibilities of nobility in different historical periods, and he drew parallels to his own situation. I see. The Duke was silent for a moment. I should speak with him. He's too young to shoulder such concerns alone. I believe he would appreciate that greatly, Your Grace. The Duke moved away from the window, pacing slowly. There is another matter I wish to discuss, the Duke continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone. Lady Worthington has made it known to me that there will be numerous introductions at the ball. She has particular ideas about my future. Florence felt a sudden tightness in her chest. I understand, Your Grace. It has been 2 years since the Duchess's passing. Society would consider it appropriate for you to look to the future. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Yes, that is the conventional wisdom. A widower with 3 children should seek a new mother for them, a new mistress for his household. The children would benefit from a maternal presence, Florence said carefully, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. Would they? They seem to have flourished under your guidance, Miss Miller. He took a step closer. You have provided them with structure, education, and, dare I say it, affection that they had been sorely lacking. Florence's pulse quickened. That is my duty as their governess, Your Grace. Is it merely duty that compels you to read to Sophia long after her bedtime when nightmares trouble her sleep? Merely duty that drives you to spend hours helping Edward overcome his fear of public speaking? Merely duty that inspires you to search for obscure botanical texts to feed Charlotte's curiosity? His perception startled her. You notice more than you reveal, Your Grace. As do you, Miss Miller. Another step brought him closer still, which is why I must ask you a question of great importance. Florence held her breath, suddenly afraid of what might follow. The modiste will deliver your gown for the ball tomorrow. I've instructed her to create something beyond what might be expected for a governess. He paused. Society will talk, of course. They always do. But I find myself increasingly indifferent to their opinions. Your Grace, Florence began, her voice barely above a whisper, I fear you may be placing me in an impossible position. I am employed as governess to your children. Any deviation from that role could only lead to difficulty for all concerned. He studied her face intently. Is that truly what you believe? That there can be no evolution of circumstance, no transformation of roles? You who teach my children daily about the great changes that have shaped our world? Evolution requires time, Your Grace, and transformation often comes at great cost. She swallowed hard. What exactly are you proposing? For the first time, uncertainty crossed his features. I am not entirely sure, Miss Miller. I only know that when I contemplate returning to Hampshire after Christmas, the thought of Hartley House without your presence in it seems unbearably empty. The raw honesty in his voice struck her deeply. Before she could formulate a response, a commotion in the hallway heralded the children's approach. The Duke stepped back, composing his features just as Edward burst into the room, followed closely by his sisters. Father, Mrs. Chambers says I'm to have a new tailcoat for the ball, like a proper gentleman, the boy exclaimed, then caught himself, remembering his manners. I mean to say, I am most grateful for your generosity, Father. The Duke's expression softened as he regarded his son. You are the heir to the Dukedom of Hanover, Edward. It is time you began to dress the part on appropriate occasions. Charlotte approached more sedately, though her eyes shone with excitement. Father, might we visit the Crystal Emporium tomorrow? Lady Worthington's granddaughter, Amelia, told me they have the most extraordinary collection of mineral specimens from all over the world. The Crystal Emporium? In Bond Street? The Duke raised an eyebrow. That's hardly a typical destination for a young lady's shopping expedition. Which is precisely why Charlotte would find it fascinating, Florence interjected gently. Miss Charlotte has been reading about geological formations in her natural philosophy text. The Duke glanced at Florence, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Indeed. Well, I suppose we might make a brief visit, if time permits. Sophia, not to be outdone, tugged at her father's coat. And might we see the great clockwork exhibition at Somerset House? Miss Miller says they have a mechanical nightingale that sings real songs. My word, you 3 have compiled quite an itinerary, the Duke chuckled, placing a hand on Sophia's head affectionately. Perhaps Miss Miller and I should confer on what might reasonably be accomplished in the days before the ball. The meaningful glance he directed at Florence was not lost on her. There was clearly more to be said between them, but it would have to wait. "Children, your father is a busy man," Florence reminded them gently. "Now, tell me about the outfits Mrs. Chambers has selected for you." As the children launched into excited descriptions, Florence was acutely aware of the Duke watching her, not with his usual reserved expression, but with something warmer, more contemplative. When he finally took his leave, promising to return for dinner, the look that passed between them held a weight of unspoken possibility that both thrilled and terrified her. The next days passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, the Duke accompanied them to both the Crystal Emporium, where Charlotte was entranced by specimens of amethyst and quartz from the Americas, and the clockwork exhibition, where Sophia clapped with delight at the mechanical nightingale's performance. They visited Gunter's for ices despite the winter chill, and even attended a puppet show in a small theatre near Covent Garden. Throughout these outings, Florence observed the Duke's transformation with quiet wonder. With each passing day, his reserve melted further, revealing a man of warmth, intellect, and surprising humour. He seemed younger somehow, unburdened, as though the rigid mask of grief he had worn for 2 years was finally beginning to crack. The day before Lady Worthington's ball, Florence's gown arrived, a creation of midnight blue silk that took her breath away. It was far grander than anything she had ever owned, with delicate silver embroidery at the hem and neckline and a matching pelisse for warmth. "My word," Mrs. Chambers murmured as Florence tried it on, "His Grace has been most generous." The housekeeper's tone conveyed volumes about what she thought of such generosity, but Florence chose not to engage with the implicit question. The gown was indeed beyond what would be appropriate for a governess attending merely in a professional capacity. That much was clear. What was less clear was what it signified about the Duke's intentions. That evening, after the children were abed, Florence found herself restless. The household had retired early in preparation for the next day's festivities, but sleep eluded her. She wrapped herself in a warm shawl and made her way quietly downstairs, thinking to borrow a book from the library to settle her mind. The library door was ajar, a soft glow of lamplight spilling into the hallway. Florence hesitated, then gently pushed it open to find the Duke seated by the fire, a book open on his lap, a glass of brandy on the table beside him. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I apologize for the intrusion. I didn't realize you were still awake." He looked up, surprise giving way to pleasure at the sight of her. "Miss Miller, no apology necessary. I found myself unable to sleep and sought distraction in Wordsworth." He gestured to the book. "Please join me if you wish, or I can leave you to your solitude if you prefer. I wouldn't wish to disturb your reading, Your Grace." "You disturb nothing but my solitude, which is a welcome interruption." He indicated the chair opposite his. "Please." Florence hesitated, then moved to take the seat he offered. The library was warm and intimate, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for the gown. It's exquisite, far more than I could have imagined." "It suits you," he replied simply. "Blue was always my favorite color. My late wife preferred pastels, pinks and yellows that complemented her fair coloring. But there is something about the depth of blue that I find compelling." Florence felt her cheeks warm at the implied compliment. "Still, it is far grander than what would be expected for someone in my position." "Ah," he set aside his book, regarding her thoughtfully. "And therein lies the crux of our unfinished conversation, does it not? Your position." "Yes, Your Grace." He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "What if I told you I have been contemplating a change in that position?" Florence's heart seemed to stop momentarily. "What sort of change, Your Grace?" "I have been thinking about the children's education as they grow older. Edward will eventually require tutors specializing in subjects appropriate for a future duke. Charlotte shows such promise in natural philosophy that I would like to engage special instructors for her as well. And Sophia," he smiled softly, "Sophia adores you so completely that I fear separating her from you would break her heart." "You're considering dividing their education among specialized tutors?" Florence asked, trying to make sense of his direction. "Not exactly. He set down his brandy glass. I'm considering creating a new position. Something akin to a director of education for all 3 children. Someone who would oversee the various tutors and ensure a cohesive approach to their learning. Someone who already understands their minds and hearts intimately. Florence's breath caught. You would have me supervise their education rather than provide it directly? Precisely. It would be a position of greater authority and fewer constraints. His eyes held hers meaningfully. It would place you on a different footing within the household. The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. A higher position would reduce, though not eliminate, the social gap between them. It would grant her more autonomy, more respect from the staff and from society. It would make whatever was growing between them slightly less scandalous. Your Grace, she began carefully, such a position sounds intriguing. But I must ask, is this truly about the children's education, or is it about something else entirely? He held her gaze steadily. Can it not be both, Florence? It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her. Society would still talk, she said softly. No matter what title you give me, I remain a clergyman's daughter without fortune or connections. The whispers would follow your children. They might face ostracism from families who would otherwise welcome them. Society always talks, he countered. They talked when I withdrew from their circles after Elizabeth died. They talked when I refused the matches they tried to arrange this past year. They will talk tomorrow night when I arrive at Lady Worthington's ball with my children and their unusually well-educated governess. He leaned closer. The question is not whether they will talk, but whether what they talk about is worth having. Florence felt breathless at his words, at the intensity of his gaze. And you believe it would be? Worth having? I believe... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe that in the past months you have brought light back into a house that had forgotten what it meant to be truly alive. I believe my children smile more, laugh more, learn more eagerly because of your presence. And I believe that I have found myself looking forward to our conversations, our meetings, even our disagreements, with an anticipation I had thought never to feel again. Florence's heart pounded in her chest. Your Grace, Albert, tomorrow, he said softly. At Lady Worthington's ball, there will be numerous eligible widows and young ladies of good family. Lady Worthington has made no secret of her intention to introduce me to several of them. She means well. She was Elizabeth's godmother and feels responsible for seeing the children provided with a new mother. As they should be, Florence whispered, though the words felt like glass in her throat. Perhaps. He reached across the space between them, his hand hovering near hers on the armrest but not quite touching. But what if the person who has already begun to fill that role in their hearts, and in mine, is already present in our lives? The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across his face. In that moment, he looked younger, vulnerable, the carefully constructed walls of his grief and reserve crumbling before her eyes. Florence knew she stood at a crossroads. The path of duty and propriety led one way, a graceful withdrawal, a reminder of their respective positions, perhaps even a resignation from her post. The other path was uncharted, dangerous, potentially scandalous, but it beckoned with a promise of joy she had never dared imagine for herself. Tomorrow, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the fire's gentle roar. At the ball. Let us see what tomorrow brings before we make decisions that cannot be unmade. He nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her words. Tomorrow, then. He withdrew his hand and stood. It grows late, and we have a significant day ahead. May I escort you to the staircase? Thank you, Your Grace, she replied, deliberately returning to formality. A reminder to them both of the current reality of their situation. As they walked together through the darkened house, their steps in perfect synchrony, Florence felt a curious mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Tomorrow would indeed bring change, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. At the foot of the stairs he bowed formally over her hand. Until tomorrow, Miss Miller. Until tomorrow, Your Grace. As she ascended to her chamber, Florence could still feel the warmth of his fingers against hers, a promise of what might be, if courage failed neither of them when morning came. Lady Worthington's Christmas ball was everything society expected from one of London's most respected hostesses. Her elegant townhouse blazed with candlelight. Evergreen boughs adorned with red ribbons festooned the staircases and mantels, and the sweet strains of a string quartet floated through rooms crowded with the cream of London society. Florence sat between Charlotte and Sophia in the Hanover carriage as it made its way through snowy streets toward their destination. Edward, looking very grown-up in his new tailcoat, sat opposite them beside his father, receiving last-minute instructions on proper deportment. "Remember, you are not required to dance, but if Lady Worthington's granddaughter or another suitable young lady should express interest in a country dance, it would be polite to accept," the Duke was saying. "Yes, father?" Edward replied solemnly, though Florence caught his nervous glance in her direction. She gave him an encouraging smile. "You've practiced the steps beautifully, Master Edward. I'm certain you'll acquit yourself admirably." The boy straightened his shoulders at her confidence, and the Duke threw her a grateful look. Florence herself felt a flutter of nerves beneath her composed exterior. The gown was the finest she had ever worn, and Mrs. Chambers had arranged her hair in an elegant style, adorned with a simple silver ribbon that matched the embroidery on her dress. She looked, she knew, far more like a lady of quality than a governess, precisely as the Duke had intended. Their arrival at Lady Worthington's caused a small stir. The Duke of Hanover had been absent from major society functions for so long that his appearance alone would have drawn attention. The presence of his children and their striking governess provoked even more interest. Lady Worthington herself descended upon them immediately, resplendent in purple silk and diamonds. "Albert, my dear boy, and the children, how marvelous you all look." She bent to kiss the children's cheeks, then straightened to regard Florence with twinkling eyes. "Miss Miller, what a vision you are. That shade of blue is most becoming." "Thank you, Lady Worthington," Florence cursed. "Your home is magnificent, especially adorned for Christmas." "Isn't it?" The elderly woman beamed, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I've seated you near Albert at dinner, my dear. Much more sensible than placing you at the governess's table, especially considering—" She trailed off meaningfully, leaving Florence to wonder exactly what the perceptive old lady had discerned about her relationship with the Duke. "Now then," Lady Worthington continued briskly, "let me introduce you all around. The children must meet their contemporaries, and Albert. There are several people most eager to renew their acquaintance with you." The next hour passed in a whirl of introductions and conversation. The children, to Florence's pride, conducted themselves beautifully. Edward engaged seriously with the sons of several prominent families. Charlotte found kindred spirits among a group of intelligent young ladies in the music room. And little Sophia charmed everyone with her artless questions and observations. The Duke remained close to Florence throughout, introducing her not as "my children's governess," but simply as "Miss Miller, who oversees my children's education," a subtle distinction that did not go unnoticed by the more observant members of society. Several ladies raised eyebrows at the unusual arrangement, while others studied Florence with undisguised curiosity. Lady Worthington, true to her word, seated Florence beside the Duke at dinner, an arrangement that caused a ripple of whispers around the table. Florence felt the scrutiny keenly, but maintained her composure, speaking when addressed, and otherwise focusing on ensuring the children, seated further down the table, conducted themselves appropriately. "You seem tense," the Duke murmured during a lull in the general conversation. "Are you regretting your decision to attend?" "Not regretting," she replied softly. "Merely aware of the attention we are attracting." His eyes followed hers to where a group of ladies were observing them with poorly concealed interest. "Let them look," he said quietly. "What they see is a man who values intelligence and genuine care for his children above hollow social connections." After dinner came dancing. The children were delighted when the Duke himself led Sophia in a simple country dance, his tall figure bending solicitously to guide her small steps. Edward, emboldened by his father's example, invited Lady Worthington's granddaughter to join the next set, while Charlotte was sought out by a serious young gentleman who shared her interest in natural philosophy. Florence watched from the side of the room, heart full at the sight of the family's joy. The Duke had transformed in these past months from a distant, grief-stricken figure to a father fully engaged with his children's lives. Whether or not anything more developed between them, she would always treasure her role in that transformation. "Miss Miller." Lady Worthington appeared beside her, observing the dancers with a satisfied expression. "You've worked wonders with those children, and with their father, I might add. You're too kind, Lady Worthington. The change in his grace has come from within, prompted, I suspect, by something or someone from without." The elderly lady patted her hand. "I've known Albert since he was Edward's age. He was always serious, always dutiful, even before tragedy struck. Elizabeth brought lightness to his life, and when she died, that light went with her." Her keen eyes fixed on Florence. "Until recently." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "I'm merely a governess, Lady Worthington." "Are you? Is that all?" The old lady chuckled. "My dear, I have lived long enough to recognize when a man looks at a woman with more than professional regard, and I have certainly lived long enough to know that happiness, true happiness, is rare enough that one should seize it when it appears, regardless of what society might whisper." Before Florence could respond, the music ended, and the Duke approached them, slightly flushed from dancing with his daughter. "Lady Worthington, you've outdone yourself with this gathering," he said, bowing over the elderly woman's hand. "The children are thoroughly enchanted, as they should be at their first proper Christmas ball." Lady Worthington's eyes twinkled mischievously. "The next dance, I believe, is a waltz, still somewhat scandalous in conservative circles, but becoming quite the fashion." She glanced meaningfully between the Duke and Florence. "I should be most disappointed if my godson did not participate in all the festivities I've arranged." With that, she moved away, leaving them alone at the edge of the dance floor. The Duke turned to Florence, something vulnerable in his expression. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Miller?" Florence hesitated. To dance a waltz with her employer would be to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. It would be a public declaration of something not yet defined between them. "Your Grace?" "Albert, people will talk." "Let them," he said simply, offering his hand. As the first strains of the waltz began, Florence placed her hand in his. He led her onto the floor, where several couples were already taking their positions. She was acutely aware of the curious gazes following them, the whispers behind fans and raised eyebrows of the ton, and then his hand was at her waist, and hers was on his shoulder, and they were moving together in perfect synchrony. The room seemed to fade around them as they turned and glided across the polished floor. He was an excellent dancer, leading with confident grace that made it easy to follow his steps. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. "My father believed dancing was an essential accomplishment, even for a clergyman's daughter," she replied, breathless not from the exertion, but from his proximity. "A wise man, your father." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Florence, Whatever he had been about to say was interrupted, as they passed close to where the children were watching, wide-eyed with delight at seeing their father and Governess waltzing together. Sophia waved excitedly, while Edward and Charlotte exchanged meaningful glances. The Duke smiled at them, then returned his attention to Florence. "They approve, it seems." "They are children," Florence reminded him gently. "They see only the fairy tale, not the complications. Perhaps we adults see too many complications and not enough fairy tales." His voice was low, intimate. "Last night you said we should wait until tonight to make decisions. Well, the night is here. The question remains." Florence took a deep breath. "What exactly is the question, Albert?" "Whether you will consider a future at Hartley House, not as a governess, but as its mistress, as my wife." The words, spoken at last, hung between them as they continued to move in time to the music. Florence's mind raced. It was more than she had allowed herself to imagine, more than she had dared to hope. "Society would never accept it," she whispered. "A duke married to his children's governess. The scandal would follow your children throughout their lives." "Society," he countered, "has short memories when it comes to scandals. In time, they would adjust. Lady Worthington already supports us, and her influence is considerable. Others would follow her lead." His eyes held hers intently. "The question is not whether they would accept it, but whether you would accept me, Florence Miller. Whether you could love a man who has been lost in grief for too long, who has only recently remembered how to live." The music swelled around them as they turned. Through the crowd, Florence caught sight of the children again, their faces alight with joy at the scene before them. In that moment she knew her answer, had perhaps known it for weeks, months even, as she watched this family heal under her care, as she felt her own heart opening to possibilities she had never before considered. "Yes," she said softly. Then more firmly, "Yes, Albert, I could love such a man. I believe I already do." The smile that transformed his face then was like the sun breaking through clouds, radiant, warm, illuminating. His hand tightened on hers as they completed the final turns of the waltz. As the music ended, they stood for a moment, still joined, aware that many eyes were upon them, but caring less with each passing second. Then, with a formality that barely contained his evident joy, the Duke bowed over her hand. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear, "you have my most profound gratitude for the care you have shown my children. I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a moment. There is a matter of some importance I wish to discuss." Florence cursed, her heart pounding. "Of course, Your Grace." He offered his arm, and together they moved toward a small anteroom adjacent to the ballroom. As they passed Lady Worthington, the elderly woman gave them a knowing smile and a discreet nod of approval. In the anteroom, lit only by a small fire and a few candles, the Duke closed the door behind them. For a moment they stood in silence, the sounds of the ball muffled by the heavy door. "Florence," he began, taking both her hands in his, "I have not done this properly. There should be courtship, time for you to be certain, arrangements made to ensure society's acceptance. But tonight, seeing you with my children, dancing with you, I find I cannot wait any longer to know." He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Will you marry me, Florence Miller? Will you become the Duchess of Hanover, mistress of Hartley House, mother to my children? Will you continue to bring light and learning and laughter into our lives, not as an employee, but as my wife and partner?" Tears filled Florence's eyes as she looked down at this proud man kneeling before her, a reversal of positions so complete it took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Albert, I will marry you." He rose to his feet, and with infinite tenderness drew her into his arms. His lips found hers in a kiss that was gentle yet profound, a sealing of promises that needed no further words. When they finally drew apart, he touched her cheek reverently. "There will be challenges ahead," whispers, disapproval from some quarters. "I know," she nodded, "but for every voice raised against us, there will be 3 children's voices raised in joy. And in time, perhaps others will see what we have found together, and understand that some conventions are worth challenging." He smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "Lady Worthington suggests a spring wedding. The apple blossoms at Hartley House are particularly beautiful in April." Florence laughed softly. "You've discussed this with Lady Worthington already?" "She guessed my intentions weeks ago when I wrote to her about your effect on the children, and on me." His expression grew serious. "Is April too soon? I would wait if you wished for more time." "April sounds perfect," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. "The children can help plan the ceremony. I think Charlotte would excel at organizing such an event. She will be ecstatic. All 3 of them will be." His hands tightened on hers. "Shall we tell them now? They're just outside, I'm certain of it. Edward has been watching me like a hawk all evening, and I caught him conferring with Lady Worthington earlier." As if on cue, a soft giggle sounded from the other side of the door, followed by a hushing sound. Florence smiled. "Yes, let's tell them now. Their approval means everything to me." The Duke moved to the door and opened it to reveal, as expected, all 3 children attempting to appear as though they had just happened to be passing by. Lady Worthington stood a discreet distance behind them, her expression innocently bland. "Children," the Duke said gravely, though his eyes danced with poorly suppressed joy, "Miss Miller and I have an announcement. We would like your opinion on a matter of great importance to our family." Edward straightened, attempting to look mature and serious. "What is it, Father?" The Duke drew Florence forward to stand beside him, his hand warm and steady around hers. "I have asked Miss Miller to become my wife, to become your mother. She has done me the great honor of accepting. But before we announce this to others, we wish to know your feelings on the matter." For a moment, the children stood frozen in apparent shock, despite their obvious eavesdropping. Then Sophia broke the silence with a squeal of delight and flung herself forward, wrapping her arms around Florence's waist. "I knew it. I knew it. Charlotte said you might marry Father and become our mother, but Edward said it wasn't proper because you're our governess. But I told him that didn't matter because you tell the best stories and make father smile again and know exactly how to make my nightmares go away. Charlotte approached more sedately, though her eyes shone. I think it's wonderful, she said simply. You've made us feel like a real family again. All eyes turned to Edward, who stood straight-backed, his expression serious beyond his years. He looked from his father to Florence and back again, then spoke with careful deliberation. Mother would have approved, he said quietly. She always said that learning and love were the most important things in life. Miss Miller, Florence, has taught us both. The Duke's hand tightened around Florence's as emotion threatened to overwhelm them both. Thank you, Edward, he said, his voice rough. That means more than you can know. Lady Worthington stepped forward, beaming. Well, that settles it. Now shall we return to the ball and make this official? I've taken the liberty of having champagne prepared for a toast. As they moved together toward the ballroom, Florence felt a curious sense of completeness. The path ahead would not be without obstacles. Society would indeed talk. Adjustments would be required of all of them, and the transition from governess to duchess would be no small challenge. Yet she had no doubt that they would face these challenges together, as a family united by something far stronger than convention or expectation. She thought of the first day she had arrived at Hartley House, of the grief-stricken Duke and his withdrawn children, of the sadness that had pervaded every corner of that grand estate. Now, as they prepared to announce their engagement to London society, she saw only joy in the faces around her, joy and the promise of a future bright with possibility. The Duke leaned close as they paused at the entrance to the ballroom. "Ready, my love," he whispered. Florence smiled up at the man who had, against all odds and expectations, found his way into her heart. "Ready," she replied, squeezing his hand, "for everything that comes next." Spring arrived at Hartley House in a riot of colour and fragrance. Apple blossoms drifted like snow across the lawns. Daffodils nodded their golden heads along the garden paths, and birdsong filled the air from dawn till dusk. It was as if nature itself celebrated the transformation that had taken place within the grand estate's walls. The months following Lady Worthington's Christmas ball had been a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. Society had indeed talked, sometimes cruelly, about the Duke of Hanover's decision to marry his children's governess. Yet Lady Worthington's unwavering support, combined with the evident happiness of the Duke and his children, had gradually turned the tide of opinion. Now, on the eve of the wedding, Florence stood at the window of what had once been her governess's chamber, gazing out at the gardens below, where workers were arranging chairs and floral displays for tomorrow's ceremony. "A penny for your thoughts, my dear," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Florence turned to find Lady Worthington regarding her with affectionate eyes. The elderly woman had arrived 3 days prior to assist with final preparations and had become an invaluable ally in navigating the complexities of Florence's new position. "Just marveling at how much has changed in so short a time," Florence replied, gesturing for her mentor to join her. "This time last year I was preparing to leave my father's vicarage, uncertain of my future, and now you are about to become the Duchess of Hanover." Lady Worthington patted her hand. "A transformation worthy of one of those novels you're so fond of reading to the children," Florence smiled. "It does seem rather like a fairy tale at times, but with far more substance," the older woman noted shrewdly. "Fairy tales rarely acknowledge the challenges that come after happily ever after. You and Albert have faced yours with admirable grace." It was true. The transition had not been entirely smooth. Some members of society still regarded their match with disapproval. Certain staff members had struggled to adjust to Florence's changing status. Even the children, though delighted by the development, had experienced moments of confusion about how to relate to their former governess in her new role. Yet, through it all, Albert had remained steadfast in his support, presenting a united front with Florence and making it clear that his decision was final and his happiness complete. "I've had excellent guidance," Florence acknowledged, squeezing Lady Worthington's hand. "Your support has meant everything, especially in those first difficult weeks in London." The elderly woman chuckled. "Society has a short memory for scandal when faced with genuine happiness, my dear. Besides, you've proven yourself more than equal to the challenge. The Chatsworth dinner party last month was managed with such elegance that even Lady Harrington was impressed. And that woman is notoriously difficult to please." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, It was Mrs. Chambers, her initial reservations about the match long since replaced by genuine affection and respect. "Begging your pardon, Miss Miller," she began, then corrected herself with a smile. "That is to say, almost, Your Grace. The children are asking for you. They've prepared some sort of surprise and are practically bursting with excitement." "I'll come at once," Florence replied, gathering her shawl. She turned to Lady Worthington. "Will you join us?" "I think not, my dear. This should be a moment for you and the children alone." The elderly woman's eyes twinkled. "Besides, I have a rather important matter to discuss with Cook regarding tomorrow's wedding breakfast." Florence made her way through now familiar corridors to the nursery, where excited whispers and giggles could be heard even before she opened the door. When she entered, all 3 children stood before her, attempting to look solemn despite their barely contained excitement. Edward, now 11 and growing taller by the day, stood in the center with his sisters flanking him. "We have something for you," he announced formally, "before you become our mother officially tomorrow." Florence felt her heart swell with emotion. "How very thoughtful. May I ask what the occasion is?" Charlotte stepped forward, her expression serious. "We've been reading about wedding traditions in different cultures. In many places, the bride receives special gifts from her new family the day before the ceremony. So we decided to make you presents," Sophia added eagerly, "to welcome you properly as our mother." "I'm deeply honored," Florence said, meaning every word. "What wonderful researchers you've become." Edward produced a small, carefully wrapped package from behind his back. "This is from all of us," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when nervous. "We worked on it together." Florence accepted the gift, noting the meticulous wrapping that surely reflected Charlotte's influence. She unwrapped it slowly, savoring the children's anticipation. Inside was a hand-bound book, its cover decorated with pressed flowers and elegant calligraphy that read, "Our Family's Story." "Open it," Sophia urged, bouncing on her toes. Florence turned to the first page and caught her breath. There, rendered in Edward's surprisingly skilled hand, was a drawing of Hartley House as it had appeared on the day of her arrival. Imposing and beautiful, yet somehow stark. The facing page held Charlotte's careful script. "Once upon a time, there stood a grand house where sadness had made its home. A duke and his 3 children lived within its walls, but laughter had forgotten the way to their door." Florence turned the page to find another illustration, this one showing her arrival in the carriage. Valise clutched to her chest, gazing up at the house with apprehension. Then one autumn day, a young woman arrived. She carried little in her trunk but books and courage and a heart ready to care. The story continued page by page, capturing pivotal moments of their journey together. Florence, reading to the children in the schoolroom, their visit to Lady Worthington's, Christmas in London, and finally the Duke's proposal at the ball. The illustrations alternated between Edward's drawings and Sophia's more exuberant style, while Charlotte's elegant handwriting narrated throughout. The final pages were blank save for a single sentence, and the story of our family continues. Tears filled Florence's eyes as she looked up at the 3 earnest faces before her. "This is the most beautiful gift I have ever received," she said softly. "You've captured our journey perfectly." "It was Father's idea," Charlotte confessed, "but we did all the work ourselves. He said it was important for us to remember how we became a family. And there's space at the end," Sophia added importantly, "for all the new chapters of our story." Florence opened her arms, and all 3 children came to her for an embrace. As she held them close, she marveled at the transformation in these young lives. Edward, once so defensive and guarded, now stood tall and responsible, taking his role as eldest seriously, but with newfound warmth. Charlotte's keen intelligence had blossomed alongside a growing confidence in her own observations. And Sophia, sweet Sophia, had emerged from her shell entirely, her natural exuberance and affection lighting up every room she entered. "I shall treasure this always," Florence promised, carefully closing the book, "and we shall fill those blank pages together, with all the adventures that lie ahead." A soft knock at the door drew their attention. Albert stood in the doorway, observing the scene with evident pleasure. "I see the secret project has been revealed at last," he said, entering the room. "I hope it meets with your approval, Florence." "It is perfect," she replied, holding his gaze. "Absolutely perfect." He smiled, the expression transforming his once severe features. These past months had altered him profoundly. Grief still visited occasionally, as was right and proper, but it no longer defined him. Laughter came more easily, and the rigid formality that had once characterized his interactions had softened, particularly with his children. "I'm glad," he said simply, then turned to the children. "Now, I believe Lady Worthington mentioned something about final fittings for tomorrow's attire. Mrs. Chambers is waiting for you in the East Wing." The children filed out obediently, though not before Sophia darted back to give Florence one more exuberant hug. When they were alone, Albert crossed to where Florence stood, taking her hands in his. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked gently. She smiled up at him. "Not about marrying you. Perhaps a little about becoming a duchess in front of half the county." "You'll outshine them all," he assured her, bringing her hand to his lips. "But that isn't why I sought you out. There's something I wish to show you before the chaos of tomorrow descends upon us." Intrigued, Florence allowed him to lead her through the house and out into the gardens. They walked together along familiar paths that wound past formal parterres and spring blooms until they reached a part of the grounds Florence had never visited, a small secluded garden enclosed by high yew hedges, with a wrought-iron gate standing slightly ajar. "Elizabeth's garden," Albert explained quietly as they paused before the entrance. "She designed it herself in the first years of our marriage. After she died, I couldn't bear to come here. The gardeners maintained it, but otherwise it has remained untouched." Florence squeezed his hand in silent understanding. "Are you sure you wish to enter now?" He nodded, his expression reflective but calm. "It seems right somehow, to acknowledge the past before we step into our future." They passed through the gate together. Inside, the small garden was a haven of tranquility. A circular lawn was surrounded by beds of roses just beginning to bud, with a stone bench positioned to catch the afternoon sun. A small fountain murmured at the center, its gentle splashing the only sound apart from distant birdsong. "It's beautiful," Florence said softly. "So peaceful." "She loved it here," Albert replied, leading her to the bench. "She would bring the children when they were very small. Edward might remember, but the girls were too young." He paused, gazing at the fountain. "I wanted you to see it before tomorrow, to know that I honor what came before, even as I embrace what lies ahead." Florence leaned against his shoulder, understanding the profound gift he was giving her in this moment. Not just access to this private space, but acknowledgement of the complex emotions that came with building a new life in the shadow of loss. "Thank you," she said simply, "for trusting me with this, with your heart, with your children." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Florence Miller, you entered our lives when we were fractured and lost. You brought wisdom and warmth and unexpected joy. Tomorrow, before God and our community, I will pledge myself to you formally. But know that my heart has been yours since that winter evening when I heard you reading to my children and remembered for the first time in years what it meant to hope for something beyond mere survival." Tears welled in Florence's eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "And I pledge myself to you, Albert Harrington, to your heart, your family, your legacy, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a continuation of love's story in this house." He drew her gently into his arms, his kiss a tender promise of all that lay ahead. When they finally parted, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the garden. "We should return," he murmured. "Lady Worthington will be scandalized if she catches us stealing moments alone on the eve of our wedding." Florence laughed, rising from the bench. "I rather think she would approve. She's surprisingly progressive for a woman of her generation." "True enough," Albert agreed, offering his arm, "though even her progressive nature has limits. Come, my love, tomorrow awaits." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with spring sunshine illuminating the estate, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Florence stood before the mirror in what had once been the Duchess's dressing room, now freshly appointed for its new mistress, as Lady Worthington supervised the final arrangements of her veil. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of elegant simplicity. Ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem, complemented by a lace veil that had been in the Harrington family for generations. Around her neck hung a single strand of pearls, Albert's gift presented that morning with a note that had brought tears to her eyes, "For the woman who brought light back to our lives." "There," Lady Worthington pronounced, stepping back to survey her handiwork. "Absolute perfection. Albert won't be able to take his eyes off you, though that's hardly a novel occurrence these days." Florence smiled, touching the pearls at her throat. "I can scarcely believe this is happening. That in an hour's time I shall be—" "The Duchess of Hanover," Lady Worthington completed, "and a most worthy one at that." The elderly woman's eyes grew serious. "My dear, I knew Elizabeth well. She was a wonderful woman, kind, intelligent, devoted to her family. She would approve of you, of this union. I want you to know that." Emotion welled in Florence's throat. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than I can express." A soft knock heralded the arrival of Charlotte and Sophia. Resplendent in matching gowns of pale blue silk, flowers woven into their carefully arranged hair. "Oh," Sophia gasped, eyes wide. "You look like an angel, Mother." The word, used for the first time, hung in the air between them, its significance not lost on anyone present. Florence knelt, heedless of her gown, and opened her arms to the little girl. "Thank you, my darling," she said softly. "And you both look absolutely beautiful." Charlotte approached more sedately, though her eyes shone with similar emotion. "Father sent us to tell you that the guests are seated, and the vicar has arrived. He says—" She paused, struggling for composure. "He says his heart is waiting for you at the altar." Florence rose, blinking back tears. "Then we mustn't keep him waiting, must we?" The ceremony took place in the estate's chapel, a jewel-like structure that had served the Harrington family for generations. It had been transformed with spring flowers and greenery into a fragrant garden. The guest list, while select, included the county's most prominent families, along with a few trusted staff members who had become more like extended family over the years. As Florence walked down the aisle on the arm of Lady Worthington's nephew, who had graciously offered to give her away in the absence of her own father, she was conscious only of Albert waiting for her before the altar, his face alight with a joy so profound it took her breath away. Beside him stood Edward, solemn and proud in his role as his father's attendant, while Charlotte and Sophia preceded Florence, scattering flower petals along the path. The service itself passed in a blur of emotion. Florence would later remember fragments with perfect clarity: the warm pressure of Albert's hand as they exchanged vows, the sunlight streaming through stained glass to cast rainbow patterns across the ancient stone floor, the vicar's voice pronouncing them husband and wife, the children's radiant faces as they witnessed the formal union of their family. The celebration that followed on the lawns of Hartley House was everything a spring wedding should be: joyous, elegant, and intimate, despite the notable guest list. Lady Worthington had ensured that even the most skeptical members of society were on their best behavior, though in truth the evident happiness of the couple won over most observers, regardless of their prior reservations. As evening approached, Florence found herself momentarily alone near the edge of the garden, watching as Albert danced with Sophia, the little girl perched on his feet as he guided her through the steps. Charlotte was deep in conversation with the naturalist who had been invited at her special request, while Edward was being taught a complex card game by several of his father's friends. "A penny for your thoughts, Your Grace," came a familiar voice. Florence turned to find Mrs. Chambers approaching, bearing a glass of champagne. "I'm not sure I'll ever grow accustomed to that title," she confessed, accepting the glass with a smile. "You will in time," the housekeeper assured her, "just as we've all grown accustomed to the changes you've brought to Hartley House, all for the better, if I may be so bold." "Thank you, Mrs. Chambers. That means a great deal, coming from you." The housekeeper hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "I served the late Duchess for many years and came to love her dearly. When she passed, I feared this house would never know joy again." She glanced toward Albert and the children. "I'm very glad to have been proven wrong." Before Florence could respond, Albert approached, having relinquished Sophia to the care of her new dance partner, an elderly gentleman who was showing her a country dance with exaggerated gallantry. "My wife," he said, the words still new enough to bring a flush to Florence's cheeks. "May I claim a dance?" As Albert led her to the center of the makeshift dance floor, the musicians struck up a waltz, the same piece they had danced to at Lady Worthington's Christmas ball. Around them, guests smiled approvingly, any lingering reservations about the match fading in the face of such evident devotion. "Happy, Duchess," Albert murmured, as they moved in perfect synchrony across the lawn. "Perfectly so, Duke," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. "Though I must confess I'm rather looking forward to when the last guest departs, and we can begin our life together properly." His eyes darkened with a promise that sent a thrill through her. "As am I, my love, as am I." Later, as twilight deepened into night and the celebration continued by lantern light, Florence gathered with Albert and the children for a private moment near the fountain in the center of the main garden. Edward, showing foresight beyond his years, had suggested they mark the day with a family tradition of his own invention. Mother, Elizabeth, always said that wishes made on important days had special power, he explained seriously. "So I thought perhaps we might each make a wish for our family's future." Florence exchanged a glance with Albert, moved by the boy's sentiment. "That's a wonderful idea, Edward." Sophia went first, dropping her copper penny into the fountain with a splash. "I wish for adventures," she declared, "and for stories every night and for no more nightmares ever." Charlotte stepped forward next, her approach more measured. "I wish for wisdom for our family," she said thoughtfully, "and for the strength to face whatever challenges may come." Her penny made barely a ripple as she placed it gently in the water. Edward's wish was simple but profound. "I wish for us to remember the past and those we've lost, while still embracing all that lies ahead." His penny spun briefly on the fountain's surface before sinking to join the others. Albert took Florence's hand as they stepped forward together. "Our wish," he said, looking into her eyes, "is for this family to continue growing in love and understanding, and for Hartley House to remain a place of learning, laughter, and light, no matter what storms may come." They released their penny together, watching as it caught the moonlight before disappearing beneath the surface. As they stood together beside the fountain, the sounds of the ongoing celebration a distant backdrop to their private communion, Florence felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with her arrival at Hartley House had led her here, to a place she had never imagined but now could not envision living without. She looked at the faces surrounding her. Albert, her husband, his eyes filled with love and promise. Edward, growing into his role as heir with newfound confidence. Charlotte, her keen mind and tender heart balanced in perfect harmony. Sophia, bubbling with joy and possibility. They were her family now, bound by choice and love rather than merely by blood or duty. "I have a feeling," she said softly, "that our story is just beginning." Albert's arm tightened around her waist as he drew her close. "Indeed it is, my love. Indeed it is." The full moon rose over Hartley House, illuminating the celebration below, a family united, a house restored, a future bright with promise. And as Florence leaned into her husband's embrace, surrounded by the children who had captured her heart, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with courage, with wisdom, and above all, with love. For in the end, that was what had transformed them all. Not duty or convention or society's expectations, but the simple, profound power of a heart willing to care, to teach, to heal, and ultimately, to love. The end. Dear listener, when night falls and the house grows quiet, isn't that when memories visit most vividly? Like you, our Duke Albert carried his past in silent moments until someone dared to light a candle in that darkness. At 60+ years of walking this earth, you've weathered storms that would have broken lesser souls. You've rebuilt after losses, celebrated triumphs others couldn't understand, and kept faith when reason suggested otherwise. This isn't empty flattery, it's the mathematics of survival. Florence found herself at Hartley House because life stripped away her alternatives, yet there, in that narrowing of paths, she discovered her truest strength. Sound familiar? When doors closed in your life, didn't the most beautiful rooms sometimes appear behind unexpected ones? Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember this. Those children recognized something in Florence that society overlooked, her inherent worth beyond titles and stations. The people who truly matter in your world see you with that same clarity. The healing in our story didn't happen overnight. Albert's grief required patience, not fixing. Your journey deserves that same gentle respect, from others and especially from yourself. Some days simply continuing forward is victory enough. May you sleep without the weight of tomorrow's concerns. May you wake with the quiet confidence of someone who has proven decade after decade that they can face whatever comes. And may you walk through each day knowing that your presence matters profoundly, not for what you accomplish, but simply because you are. Rest well, dear friend. You've earned it. With heartfelt appreciation, The Legends of the Fall Team. If this story touched your heart, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, like the video, and share it with someone who might enjoy a moment of tenderness and hope today. Your support truly means the world to us. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for encouraging us to keep creating and sharing new stories filled with love, redemption, and powerful emotional twists. It is because of you that we find the strength and inspiration to continue. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another story from our channel. Click on it and let yourself be surprised by another emotional and unforgettable journey. With all our gratitude, The Legends of the Fall Team.